The brass key felt ice-cold in my trembling fingers as I stood before the weathered oak door of the Blackwood Estate's attic. 3 months had passed since I'd inherited this Victorian monstrosity from my great-aunt Cordelia, and I'd avoided this particular room until tonight. But the sounds, those damn sounds, had been growing louder each evening, and I could no longer ignore what lurked above. The estate agent had mentioned Cordelia's collection in passing, but nothing could have prepared me for what I was about to discover. As the key turned with a grinding click that seemed to echo through the entire house, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October wind rattling the windows below. The door creaked open on rusted hinges, releasing the musty scent of decades-old secrets. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the stagnant air. But it wasn't the dust that made my breath catch, it was the eyes. Hundreds of them. Glass eyes, button eyes, painted eyes, all staring down at me from the shadows. Dolls. Everywhere I turned my light, porcelain faces emerged from the gloom like pale moons in a midnight sky. They sat on shelves that lined every wall, perched on antique chairs, and hung from the rafters by thin wire nooses that swayed gently in the disturbed air. I'd heard about Cordelia's obsession, whispered about in hushed tones at family gatherings. How she'd traveled the world collecting dolls from estate sales, antique shops, and private collectors who were eager to be rid of their unsettling inventory. But seeing the collection firsthand was like stepping into a fever dream. My footsteps creaked on the old floorboards as I ventured deeper into the attic. The beam of my flashlight swept across a particularly ornate shelf, and I froze. There, sitting in the center like a tiny queen holding court, was the most beautiful and terrifying doll I'd ever seen. She was perhaps 2 feet tall, with cascading ringlets of real human hair the color of spun gold. Her porcelain skin was flawless, painted with such skill that she seemed almost alive. But it was her eyes that held me captive, deep blue glass orbs that seemed to follow my movement with an intelligence that chilled me to the bone. She wore a pristine white dress with intricate lace trim, and in her delicate hands, she clutched a smaller doll, a grotesque thing with cracked features and one missing eye. A small brass placard at the base of her shelf read, "Evangeline, acquired 1923, warning, handle with extreme caution." Warning? I almost laughed at the absurdity, but the sound died in my throat as I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Every other doll in the attic was facing toward Evangeline, as if she were the center of some unholy congregation. Even those hanging from the ceiling had somehow turned to orient themselves in her direction. I backed away, my heart hammering against my ribs, but my foot caught on something soft. Looking down, I saw I'd stepped on a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. With trembling hands, I picked it up and opened to the first entry, written in Cordelia's spidery handwriting. September 15, 1923. She arrived today from the Pemberton estate in Salem. The previous owner was most eager to be rid of her, though he wouldn't say why. There's something about this doll, Evangeline, according to the documentation, that seems almost alive. When I placed her on the shelf, I could have sworn she smiled. I flipped through several pages, my growing dread confirmed by each successive entry. September 20, 1923. I woke last night to the sound of footsteps in the attic. When I investigated, I found several dolls had moved from their original positions. All were facing Evangeline. Surely I'm imagining things, dolls don't move on their own. Do they? October 1, 1923. I can no longer deny what I'm seeing. Evangeline moves. Not just her position, but her expressions change. Yesterday she was smiling, today she looks angry. And the other dolls? They seem to obey her somehow. I've started locking the attic, but I fear it won't be enough. October 13, 1923. Something terrible has happened. My young housemaid, Mary, went missing 3 days ago. The police found her this morning in the garden pond, drowned. But how could she have fallen in? The pond isn't deep enough, and Mary was an excellent swimmer. I fear Evangeline had something to do with it. I know how mad that sounds, but the doll was missing from her shelf the night Mary disappeared. I found her the next morning sitting by my bedroom door, still dripping wet. My hands shook as I continued reading, each entry more disturbing than the last. Cordelia documented years of strange occurrences, servants quitting without notice, pets disappearing, and always, Evangeline at the center of it all. The final entry was dated just 2 weeks before Cordelia's death. August 3, 1987. I'm dying, and I know Evangeline knows it. She's been more active lately, more aggressive. Last night I found her sitting on my chest when I woke, those terrible blue eyes boring into mine. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She's growing stronger as I grow weaker. Whoever inherits this house must be warned. The collection must never be separated. As long as they're all together, Evangeline is contained. But if anyone tries to remove her, God help them. A sudden sound made me drop the journal, the soft patter of tiny footsteps above my head. Impossible. This was the top floor of the house. There was nothing above the attic but the roof. I aimed my flashlight upward and gasped. The dolls hanging from the rafters were swaying more violently now, their tiny bodies twisting on their wire nooses like hanged criminals in a macabre dance. And among them, I saw something that made my blood freeze, fresh muddy footprints across the ceiling beams, small and childlike. The temperature in the attic plummeted suddenly, my breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The floorboards beneath my feet groaned ominously, and I heard what sounded like children's laughter echoing from the walls themselves. But it wasn't joyful laughter, it was the hollow, echoing sound of something trying to remember what happiness felt like. I spun around, desperate to escape, but stopped dead when my flashlight beam fell on Evangeline's shelf. The beautiful doll was no longer sitting in the center. She was gone. Panic seized me as I frantically swept the light across the attic, searching for any sign of movement. The other dolls seemed to leer at me from the shadows, their painted smiles now appearing sinister and knowing. How had I not noticed before how many of them were smiling? And why did those smiles look so hungry? A soft giggle echoed through the attic, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then I heard it, a voice, sweet and innocent, but with an underlying edge that set my teeth on edge. "We've been waiting for you." I whirled around, following the voice, and there she was. Evangeline stood at the far end of the attic, no longer the beautiful, pristine doll I'd first seen. Her white dress was stained with dark patches that looked suspiciously like dried blood. Her golden hair hung in matted tangles around her face, and that perfect porcelain skin was cracked and spiderwebbed with age. But worst of all were her eyes, no longer the innocent blue glass orbs, but black holes that seemed to absorb light itself. "Aunt Cordelia told us you would come," she continued, her voice like broken glass wrapped in silk. "She said you were family. We like family." As she spoke, I became aware of movement all around me. The other dolls were climbing down from their shelves with jerky, unnatural motions. Some crawled on all fours like animals, while others lurched forward on legs that bent in impossible directions. Their collective footsteps created a nightmare symphony of tiny taps and scrapes against the wooden floor. I backed toward the door, but my escape was cut off by a line of advancing dolls. They moved in perfect synchronization, like soldiers in some hellish army. Their faces had changed too, features shifting and morphing as I watched, smiles becoming snarls, innocent expressions twisting into masks of malevolence. "We've been so lonely," Evangeline said, gliding closer without seeming to move her legs. "Cordelia used to visit us every day, but then she got sick. We tried to help her, but she was so fragile. Humans always are." The memory of Cordelia's death certificate flashed through my mind. Heart failure, the doctor had said. But looking at Evangeline's terrifying smile, I wondered if my great-aunt's heart had simply stopped from fear. "We need someone new to take care of us," the doll continued. "Someone to play with us. Forever." The word forever echoed through the attic, repeated by dozens of tiny voices. The advancing dolls began to circle me, their movements hypnotic and horrifying. I clutched my flashlight like a weapon, though what good it would do against an army of supernatural toys, I couldn't imagine. That's when I noticed the salt. Cordelia had been more clever than I'd given her credit for. White lines of salt formed intricate patterns across the floor, protective circles and symbols I recognized from my college folklore classes. As long as I stayed within the largest circle, I was safe. But it also meant I was trapped. Evangeline seemed to sense my realization and let out a laugh that sounded like breaking china. Oh yes, Auntie's little protections. She was quite the scholar of the occult in her later years. Learned all sorts of interesting things about binding spirits and containing evil. But even she couldn't hold us forever. As if to demonstrate her point, several dolls began kicking at the salt lines with their tiny feet, scattering the white grains across the floor. Each break in the protective circle felt like a nail in my coffin. Tell me, I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded despite the terror coursing through my veins, what are you? What do you want? Evangeline tilted her head with an expression of mock consideration. What are we? We are the forgotten children, the unloved ones. Every doll in this room once belonged to a child who died, murdered, lost, abandoned. We are their pain given form, their innocence twisted into something else. And what we want is simple, we want to play. She gestured to the smaller doll still clutched in her porcelain hands. This is Tommy. He was 5 when his father pushed him down the stairs in a drunken rage. And that one there, she pointed to a china doll with rosy cheeks and vacant eyes, is little Sarah. She died in the influenza outbreak of 1918, alone in an orphanage where no one cared enough to remember her name. Each doll she indicated seemed to nod or wave, as if acknowledging their tragic introduction. The horror of it settled over me like a suffocating blanket. These weren't just haunted objects, they were repositories of human suffering, collecting and preserving pain like some twisted museum. But you, Evangeline continued, her black eyes fixing on mine with terrifying intensity, you're different. Your family. Cordelia's blood runs in your veins, and that makes you special. You can hear us, see us, understand us in ways others cannot. We've been calling to you for months, haven't we? Drawing you here? The sounds I'd been hearing, the footsteps, the laughter, the whispers in the walls. It all made horrible sense now. They'd been trying to communicate, to lure me up here for this moment. More salt scattered as the dolls continued their assault on Cordelia's protective barriers. I could see gaps forming in the circles, dark spaces where malevolent energy seeped through like poison. My sanctuary was crumbling, and with it, my chances of escape. There's another way, I said desperately, remembering something from Cordelia's journal. You said the collection must never be separated. What if I helped you find a new home? Somewhere you could all stay together? Evangeline's expression shifted, curiosity replacing some of the hunger in her features. You would do that? You wouldn't try to separate us or destroy us? Never, I lied, though my voice carried enough conviction to give her pause. But I need to understand more about you, about how you came to be. Help me help you. It was a desperate gambit, but it seemed to work. Evangeline raised a tiny hand, and the other dolls stopped their assault on the salt lines. The temperature in the attic rose slightly, and the oppressive feeling of malevolence eased just enough for me to breathe normally again. Very well, Evangeline said. But understand this, we can sense deception. Lie to us, betray us, and your death will make Cordelia seem peaceful by comparison. She glided back to her shelf and settled into her original position, though her eyes never left mine. It began in 1847, she said, her voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller. I was created by a dollmaker named Heinrich Zimmermann for his daughter, Clara. Heinrich was a gifted artisan, but he was also obsessed with the occult. He believed he could bind souls to objects, preserving them beyond death. The other dolls arranged themselves in a semicircle around us, their attention focused on Evangeline like children gathered for a bedtime story. But this was no fairy tale. Clara was dying of consumption, Evangeline continued. Heinrich couldn't bear the thought of losing her, so he performed a ritual. Using her hair, her blood, and a piece of her soul, he bound her essence to me. When Clara died 3 days later, she didn't move on to whatever comes after. She was trapped, anchored to this porcelain shell. The tragedy of it hit me like a physical blow. A father's love twisted into something monstrous, dooming his daughter to an eternity of supernatural imprisonment. But Heinrich had made a mistake, Evangeline said, her painted features seeming to shift in the flashlight's glow. The ritual didn't just bind Clara's soul, it created a beacon for other lost spirits. Children who died in pain, in fear, in sorrow, were drawn to me like moths to flame. One by one, they possessed the dolls in Heinrich's workshop, and then every doll they encountered. She gestured to the assembled collection. We are legion now. Hundreds of children who never got to grow up, never got to live full lives. And we've learned to survive by moving from collection to collection, always staying together, always searching for someone who can see us as we truly are. What happened to Heinrich? I asked, though I suspected I didn't want to know the answer. Evangeline's smile returned, cold and terrible. He tried to destroy us when he realized what he'd done. We couldn't allow that. He was found in his workshop, torn apart by his own tools. The authorities blamed wild animals, but we know the truth. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the full scope of what I was dealing with. This wasn't just a haunted doll, it was a supernatural infection, spreading from collection to collection, leaving death and madness in its wake. "How many?" I whispered. "How many people have you killed?" "Only those who threatened us," Evangeline replied without a trace of remorse. "Collectors who tried to separate us, skeptics who sought to prove we were mere objects, exorcists who attempted to send us away. We do what we must to survive." The salt circles were nearly destroyed now, and I could feel the doll's malevolent energy pressing against the remaining barriers like water against a crumbling dam. I had to act soon, but what could I do against such an ancient and powerful evil? That's when I remembered the one detail from Cordelia's journal that had stuck with me: as long as they're all together, Evangeline is contained. The collection wasn't just a gathering of haunted dolls, it was a supernatural prison, with Evangeline as both the warden and the most dangerous inmate. "You're afraid," I said suddenly, the realization hitting me like a thunderbolt. "That's why you insist on staying together. It's not just about companionship, you need the other dolls to contain your power. Without them, you'd be too strong, too visible. The living world would notice you and find ways to stop you." Evangeline's expression darkened, and the temperature in the attic plummeted again. "Clever," she hissed. "But not clever enough." The remaining salt barriers exploded outward as every doll in the attic rushed toward me at once. I dove to the side, my flashlight spinning through the air and casting wild shadows across the walls. In the strobing light, the advancing dolls looked like something from the deepest pits of hell, their faces contorted with rage, their tiny hands reaching for me with murderous intent. I scrambled toward the door, but small hands grabbed at my ankles, clawing and scratching with surprising strength. One doll, a baby doll with a cracked skull, latched onto my leg with teeth that felt far too real and sharp for painted porcelain. "You understand now," Evangeline's voice echoed through the chaos. "We are not bound by your mortal limitations. We are death and sorrow given form, and we will not be contained any longer." I kicked frantically, dislodging several dolls, and lunged for the attic door. My hand closed around the brass handle just as something heavy slammed into my back, sending me sprawling onto the landing outside the attic. Behind me, I could hear the furious sounds of the doll army trying to follow, but something held them back. Gasping, I looked back and saw that the doorframe itself was inscribed with protective symbols, another one of Cordelia's safeguards. The dolls could move freely within the attic, but they couldn't leave it. At least, not yet. Evangeline appeared in the doorway, her beautiful face twisted with fury. "You cannot run forever," she snarled. "This house is our domain now. Every room, every shadow, every dark corner belongs to us. We will find you, and when we do, you will beg for the mercy we showed Cordelia." I slammed the door shut and turned the key, though I knew it would only buy me time. The sounds from within the attic continued, scratching, pounding, and that terrible children's laughter that would haunt my dreams for years to come. Racing down the stairs to the main floor, I tried to process what I'd learned. The dolls were trapped in the attic by Cordelia's protective barriers, but those safeguards were weakening. It was only a matter of time before they broke free entirely, and when they did, nowhere in the house would be safe. I needed help, but who would believe such an impossible story? The police would think I was mad, and any paranormal investigators I'd seen on television seemed more interested in entertainment than actual solutions. No, this was something I'd have to handle myself. In Cordelia's study, I found more of her research, books on demonology, occultism, and supernatural binding rituals. She'd spent decades studying the curse that had invaded her home, looking for a way to either control or destroy it. Her notes were extensive, filled with failed experiments and dead-end theories. But there was one entry that caught my attention, dated just a month before her death. "I believe I've found the answer at last. The doll's power comes from their collective suffering, but it's channeled through Evangeline. She is the nexus, the focal point that gives them form and purpose. If she could be destroyed, truly destroyed, not just damaged, the others would lose their cohesion and return to being mere objects. But destroying her won't be simple. She's protected by the others, and her own supernatural essence makes her nearly indestructible. Fire might work, but it would have to be a very special kind of fire, one that burns the soul as well as the material form. The margin notes referenced a particular type of ancient Greek fire, used in exorcism rituals to purge spiritual corruption. The ingredients were rare but not impossible to obtain, and Cordelia had apparently gathered most of what was needed before her death overtook her efforts. As I read through her meticulous preparations, a plan began to form in my mind. It was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it might be the only way to end the nightmare that had consumed 3 generations of my family. The grinding sound of metal on wood echoed through the house, followed by a triumphant shriek that made my blood freeze. They were free. I could hear them moving through the house now, dozens of tiny footsteps spreading out like a supernatural infection. They were searching for me, but they were also exploring their new territory, claiming it as their own. Every few minutes, I'd hear the crash of breaking glass or the thud of furniture being overturned. They were making themselves at home. Working quickly, I gathered the materials Cordelia had collected: white phosphorus powder, blessed salt from a desecrated church, herbs that had been harvested during lunar eclipses, and a vial of what her notes claimed was tears of the innocent, though I didn't want to know how she'd obtained that particular ingredient. The ritual had to be performed at dawn, when the barrier between the spirit world and the physical realm was at its thinnest. That gave me roughly 4 hours to prepare, assuming I could survive that long. A soft tapping at the study door interrupted my preparations. It was a delicate sound, like a child politely asking for attention. But I knew better than to answer. "We know you're in there," came Evangeline's voice, muffled by the heavy oak door. "We can smell your fear, taste your desperation. It's delicious." The tapping continued, joined by other sounds, scratching, like tiny fingernails dragging across wood, and a wet sliding noise that I didn't want to identify. They were testing the door's defenses, looking for weaknesses in Cordelia's protective barriers. "Your great-aunt lasted almost 60 years in this house," Evangeline continued conversationally. "She was quite resourceful, I'll give her that. But even she couldn't escape us forever. And you're not nearly as prepared as she was." As if to prove her point, the lights in the study flickered and died. My flashlight had been lost in the attic, leaving me in complete darkness. But I'd anticipated this. Cordelia's notes had warned that the dolls could manipulate electrical systems. I fumbled for the oil lamp I'd prepared and managed to light it with shaking hands. The warm glow revealed that I wasn't alone in the study. Small shadows moved along the baseboards, dolls that had somehow found another way in. But these weren't like the ones in the attic. These were the house's original inhabitants, antique dolls that Cordelia had kept on display in the main rooms. Evangeline's influence was spreading, reanimating every doll in the house. "Did you really think your aunt's little salt circles could keep us out forever?" Evangeline's laughter echoed from somewhere inside the walls themselves. "We've had decades to study her defenses, to find the flaws and exploit them. This entire house is our web now, and you're the fly caught in its center." One of the shadow dolls darted toward me with inhuman speed. I swung the oil lamp at it, the flame casting wild patterns across the walls. The doll shrieked as the fire touched it, its small form dissolving into wisps of acrid smoke. But there were others, and they were learning to avoid the light. I needed to reach the ritual site. Cordelia's notes indicated that the ceremony had to be performed in the house's original foundation, in what had once been the root cellar. But that meant leaving the relative safety of the study and navigating through a house full of supernatural predators. The oil lamp wouldn't last long, and I couldn't carry all the ritual materials and maintain a flame at the same time. I'd have to choose between light and the components I needed to end this nightmare. A new sound reached my ears, the slow, deliberate footsteps of something much larger than a doll. They were coming up from the basement, each step accompanied by a wet, dragging noise that turned my stomach. Whatever Evangeline had summoned from the depths of the house, it was something far worse than animated toys. The study door exploded inward, splinters of wood flying across the room like shrapnel. In the doorway stood something that had once been a doll but had grown into a nightmare amalgamation of porcelain, cloth, and stolen flesh. It was roughly human-sized now, cobbled together from parts of dozens of different dolls, with multiple arms and faces that shifted and changed as I watched. "Did you think we were limited to our original forms?" The creature spoke with Evangeline's voice, though the sound came from multiple mouths scattered across its patchwork body. "We are so much more than mere dolls now. We are evolution. We are adaptation. We are your new gods." I grabbed the ritual components and dove through the study's back window, glass cutting into my arms as I tumbled onto the garden below. The creature's inhuman shriek of rage followed me into the night air, along with the sounds of more windows breaking as the entire doll army gave chase. The garden was no safer than the house. In the pale moonlight, I could see dozens of small figures emerging from the shadows: garden gnomes, decorative cherubs, even the carved gargoyles from the roof corners had joined Evangeline's supernatural army. Anything with a face, anything that could serve as a vessel for trapped souls, had become her servant. I ran toward the old root cellar, clutching the ritual materials against my chest. Behind me, the night filled with the sounds of pursuit, tiny feet pattering across gravel, inhuman voices calling out my location, and always that wet, dragging sound of the composite creature as it followed my trail. The root cellar entrance was hidden beneath a tangle of dead vines and fallen leaves. As I cleared the debris with bleeding hands, I could feel them getting closer. A small stone cherub latched onto my ankle, its cherubic face twisted into a snarl of pure malice. I kicked it away, sending it tumbling into a rose bush where it immediately began clawing its way free. The cellar door was locked, but the old wood gave way easily under my desperate assault. I tumbled down the stone steps into absolute darkness, the oil lamp having been lost in my escape from the house. But I knew from Cordelia's notes that there should be emergency supplies down here: candles, matches, and most importantly, a pre-prepared ritual circle. My hands found a wooden shelf and groped along its surface until I located a box of matches. The first three broke in my shaking fingers, but the fourth flared to life, revealing a small cellar room that looked more like an underground temple than a storage space. Cordelia had transformed the root cellar into a sanctuary, its stone walls carved with protective symbols and lined with mirrors that reflected the candlelight in dizzying patterns. In the center of the room was a circle of black salt, inscribed with symbols I recognized from her research. This was where she'd planned to make her final stand against the doll's evil. I lit the candles arranged around the circle and began setting up the ritual components according to her detailed instructions. The white phosphorus had to be mixed with the blessed salt in precise proportions, while the herbs needed to be arranged in a specific pattern that would focus and amplify the spiritual fire. Above me, I could hear them breaking into the house in force. Furniture crashed, walls splintered, and that terrible children's laughter echoed through the floorboards. They knew where I was, but they also seemed to be taking their time. They were savoring the hunt, drawing out my terror for their own amusement. The cellar door burst open just as I completed the circle preparations. Evangeline's composite creature flowed down the steps like a tide of living porcelain and cloth, its multiple faces all wearing the same expression of hungry anticipation. "Did you think stone walls could keep us out?" it asked, though its voice now came from every mirror in the room, creating a disorienting echo effect. "This cellar is part of our domain now. There is nowhere left to run." But I wasn't trying to run anymore. As the creature approached the edge of the ritual circle, I began the incantation Cordelia had written in her careful script. The words were in Latin, Greek, and languages I didn't recognize, ancient tongues that predated Christianity, calling on powers older than human civilization. The effect was immediate. The mirrors began to glow with an inner light that had nothing to do with the candles, and the temperature in the cellar rose dramatically. The composite creature stumbled backward, its multiple faces showing expressions of surprise and pain. "Impossible," it hissed. "You're not trained in the old ways. You can't possibly understand what you're doing." "You're right," I admitted, continuing the incantation even as sweat poured down my face. "I don't understand it. But my great-aunt did, and she left very detailed instructions." The ritual ingredients began to smoke and spark as the spiritual energy built to a crescendo. The white phosphorus glowed like a miniature sun, while the blessed salt formed geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. And at the center of it all, something was taking shape, a doorway made of pure light, leading to a place where the laws of the physical world held no sway. Through that doorway, I could see them, the real children whose souls had been trapped and twisted by Evangeline's curse. They looked as they had in life, before pain and supernatural corruption had transformed them into instruments of malice. And they were reaching toward the light with expressions of desperate hope. "No." Evangeline's true voice echoed through the cellar, filled with a century of accumulated rage and despair. "I won't let them go. They belong to me. I am their mother, their protector, their God." The composite creature lunged toward the circle, but the spiritual barriers held it back. Smoke rose from its porcelain skin wherever it touched the light, and its multiple faces began to crack and crumble. But something was wrong. The ritual was working too well, too fast. The doorway of light was expanding beyond my control, and I could feel it pulling at something inside me, my own soul, perhaps, or my life force. Cordelia's notes had mentioned this risk, but I'd been too desperate to consider the consequences. As the light grew brighter, I saw Evangeline herself for the first time, not the beautiful doll she'd appeared to be, but the twisted remnant of Heinrich Zimmermann's daughter. She was a shadow wrapped in porcelain, held together by grief and rage and a father's misguided love. "Please," she whispered, and for a moment she looked like what she truly was, a frightened child who'd been dead for over a century. "Don't send me away. I don't want to be alone again." The plea hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a monster, it was a victim, a little girl whose father's desperate love had doomed her to an eternity of supernatural imprisonment. But I also knew that her pain had been responsible for countless deaths, including Cordelia's, and would continue to spread if I didn't finish what I'd started. "You don't have to be alone," I said, struggling to maintain the incantation as the ritual's energy threatened to tear me apart. "Look around you. Look at all the children who've been waiting for you to let them go." Through the doorway of light, I could see dozens of child spirits, all reaching toward Evangeline with forgiveness rather than accusation. They understood her pain because they'd shared it, but they also knew that their only hope of peace lay in moving beyond the physical world entirely. Evangeline looked at them with eyes that were no longer black holes but the frightened blue orbs of a dying child. "Clara?" she whispered, using her real name for the first time. "Is that really what I look like now?" The composite creature was dissolving, its component parts falling away as the spirits that had animated them were drawn toward the light. Around the cellar, I could hear the sounds of dozens of dolls collapsing as their supernatural animators abandoned them for the promise of true rest. "I'm so tired," Evangeline said, her voice fading as her hold on the physical world weakened. "I've been tired for so long." "Then rest," I whispered, pouring the last of my strength into the ritual. "Let go, Clara. Let them all go." With a sound like 1,000 children sighing in relief, the spirits flowed through the doorway of light and disappeared into whatever lay beyond. Evangeline was the last to go, pausing at the threshold to look back at me with an expression of profound gratitude. "Thank you," she said. "For seeing us as we really were. For giving us the choice we never had." And then she was gone, taking her army of lost souls with her. The doorway collapsed in on itself, the mirrors went dark, and the cellar fell silent except for the sound of my own ragged breathing. I don't know how long I lay there on the cold stone floor, drained of energy and barely conscious. When I finally managed to climb the stairs and emerge into the pre-dawn darkness, the house looked different somehow, smaller, less oppressive, as if a great weight had been lifted from its foundations. The dolls were still there, scattered throughout the rooms where they'd fallen when the spirits abandoned them. But they were just dolls now, porcelain and cloth and button eyes, nothing more. The supernatural infection that had plagued the Blackwood estate for generations was finally gone. I spent the next 3 days burning dolls in the garden bonfire, making sure that none remained to potentially harbor any residual spiritual energy. The flames turned strange colors as they consumed the cursed toys, and more than once I thought I heard children's voices in the crackling of the fire, but these were sounds of joy and freedom, not the malevolent whispers I'd grown to fear. When the last doll was reduced to ash, I scattered the remains in the garden pond where Mary the housemaid had drowned nearly a century ago. It seemed fitting that the place where Evangeline's malevolence had first claimed a life should be where her story finally ended. But as I stood by the water's edge, watching the gray ashes dissolve into the murky depths, I realized that my ordeal wasn't completely over. The ritual had drained something from me, not just physical energy, but something deeper. I could feel the absence like a hollow ache in my chest, as if part of my soul had been burned away along with the supernatural curse. The next few weeks passed in a blur of paperwork and practicalities. I put the Blackwood estate up for sale, though I was honest with potential buyers about its history. Surprisingly, this didn't deter interest. Apparently, a fully exorcised haunted house was considered quite a prize among certain collectors of the paranormal. The final buyer was a professor of folklore from the local university, Dr. Margaret Thornfield, who specialized in the documentation and preservation of supernatural events. She'd heard rumors about the Blackwood collection and was fascinated by what I'd experienced. "You do realize what you accomplished, don't you?" she asked as we signed the final papers in her cluttered office. "Successful spiritual exorcisms of this magnitude are incredibly rare. Most end in either failure or the death of everyone involved. I thought about Cordelia, who'd spent 60 years trapped in that house with her supernatural prisoners, slowly worn down by the constant psychic assault until her heart simply couldn't take any more. Had she known what the ritual would cost me? Had she planned for someone else to pay the price she couldn't afford? There's something else you should know, Dr. Thornfield continued, pulling out a thick folder. The Blackwood collection wasn't unique. I've been tracking similar cases across the country, other collectors who've encountered the same type of phenomenon. Your Evangeline wasn't the only one of her kind. My blood ran cold as she showed me photographs and documents from dozens of other cases. Dolls with the same perfect porcelain features, the same knowing eyes, the same ability to command supernatural armies. All connected, all part of some larger pattern that stretched back generations. Heinrich Zimmermann didn't just create one cursed doll, she explained. He created a template, a spiritual virus that could spread and replicate itself. Every time one of these entities is destroyed properly, another one seems to manifest somewhere else, as if the original curse is constantly seeking new vessels. She leaned forward, her eyes intense behind wire-rimmed glasses. I believe what you experienced was just one battle in a much larger war. The question is, are you prepared to fight that war? I left her office with more questions than answers, and a growing certainty that my encounter with the supernatural wasn't an isolated incident but the beginning of something much larger. That night, alone in my apartment, I found myself staring at every doll and figurine in my possession with suspicious eyes. A ceramic angel on my bookshelf, a wooden marionette from a childhood trip to Europe, even the stuffed animals from my youth, all suddenly seemed like potential threats. Sleep, when it finally came, brought no peace. I dreamed of children's voices calling to me from dark places, of porcelain faces that shifted and changed when I wasn't looking directly at them, of tiny footsteps following me through empty corridors that seemed to stretch on forever. And always, threading through the nightmares like a poisonous melody, came Evangeline's voice, "We are Legion now. We are evolution. We are your new gods." 3 months after the exorcism, I received a letter with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, a pristine Victorian doll with golden ringlets and blue glass eyes, sitting in what looked like an antique shop window. On the back, someone had written, "She's waiting for you in Portland. A friend." I should have thrown the photograph away. I should have ignored it and tried to rebuild my normal life. But the hollow ache in my chest had been growing stronger, and I was beginning to understand what the ritual had truly cost me. Part of my soul was now attuned to the supernatural world, forever sensitive to the presence of things that shouldn't exist. I could feel them out there, other collections, other cursed dolls, other Evangelines waiting in the shadows of antique stores and estate sales. The spiritual virus that Heinrich Zimmermann had unleashed on the world was still spreading, still claiming victims, still growing stronger with each passing year. The drive to Portland took 8 hours, but it felt like a journey into another world. With each mile, the hollow ache in my chest grew more intense, confirming what I'd already suspected. I wasn't just following a lead, I was being drawn, called by forces beyond my understanding or control. The antique shop was exactly as I'd seen it in the photograph, tucked between a used bookstore and a coffee house in Portland's historic district. The sign above the door read Memories and Dreams Antiques, and the window display featured an assortment of vintage toys and collectibles. But I only had eyes for one item, the doll from the photograph, now positioned so that she seemed to be looking directly at me through the glass. She was perfect. Too perfect. Her porcelain skin was flawless, her golden hair arranged in precise ringlets, her white dress without a single stain or wrinkle. But it was her eyes that confirmed my worst fears, the same intelligent blue orbs that seemed to follow my movement, the same hint of malevolent awareness lurking behind an innocent facade. This wasn't Evangeline, but she was definitely family. The shop's owner was an elderly man named Mr. Chen, who greeted me with the nervous energy of someone who'd been expecting trouble. "You're here about the doll," he said before I could even introduce myself. "Third person this week. Something about her seems to draw people in." "How long have you had her?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "About a month. Came from an estate sale in Seattle, elderly woman who'd kept her locked in a trunk for 40 years. Poor thing seemed eager to be rid of her, practically gave her away." He glanced nervously at the window display. "Been having some strange experiences since she arrived, if I'm being honest. Things moving around, temperature drops, and the other dolls in the shop seem too Respond to her presence. As if to demonstrate his point, a music box on a nearby shelf suddenly began playing a tinkling melody, even though its lid remained closed. Mr. Chen jumped at the sound, and I noticed that several other antique dolls throughout the shop had turned their heads to face the window where the golden-haired doll sat. "I'll take her," I said, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. "How much?" "Just take her," Mr. Chen replied, already moving toward the window display. "Please. I can't afford to have her in the shop any longer. Strange things have been happening, and I'm starting to lose customers." As he carefully lifted the doll from her perch, I noticed that her expression seemed to shift slightly, a barely perceptible change that transformed her innocent smile into something more knowing, more predatory. Her blue glass eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Hello," she whispered, so softly that only I could hear. "I've been waiting for you." The drive back to my apartment was a nightmare of supernatural manifestations. The doll, now sitting in a cardboard box on my passenger seat, seemed to radiate malevolent energy that affected every electronic device in my car. The radio cycled through static-filled stations on its own, the GPS gave contradictory directions that would have led me in circles, and the temperature gauge fluctuated wildly despite the engine running normally. But worse than the mechanical problems were the voices. Children's whispers seemed to emanate from the car's ventilation system, speaking in languages I didn't recognize but somehow understanding anyway. They were calling to her, these trapped spirits, drawn by the same supernatural beacon that had made Evangeline so powerful. By the time I reached my apartment, I'd counted at least a dozen distinct voices, each one representing another child's soul that had been claimed by whatever entity now inhabited the doll. The infection was spreading again, just as Dr. Thornfield had predicted. I set up the same type of protective barriers in my apartment that Cordelia had used in the Blackwood estate: salt circles, protective symbols, mirrors positioned to reflect negative energy. But even as I worked, I could feel the doll's influence spreading through my home like a spiritual plague. The other dolls and figurines I owned were responding to her presence, their positions shifting when I wasn't looking, their faces seeming more animated than mere paint and porcelain should allow. A collector's edition action figure turned its head to track my movement across the room. A ceramic cat figurine's expression changed from placid to menacing. Even the stuffed animals seemed to be watching me with button eyes that held too much intelligence. That night, I didn't even attempt to sleep. Instead, I sat in the center of my largest protection circle, surrounded by candles and holding vigil over the doll who sat in her own smaller circle across the room. She remained motionless, but I could feel her consciousness probing at my defenses, testing the strength of my barriers, looking for weaknesses to exploit. "What do you want?" I finally asked, breaking the hours of tense silence. Her head turned with a soft grinding sound, blue glass eyes focusing on mine with predatory intelligence. "I want what we all want," she replied in a voice like broken crystal. "I want to live. I want to play. I want a family who will never leave me." "You're not alive," I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. "You're just an echo, a reflection of someone who died long ago." "Are you so certain?" She tilted her head with an expression of mock curiosity. "What makes you more real than me? You breathe, you bleed, you'll age and die and be forgotten. I am eternal. I am perfect. I am everything a child should be, preserved forever in porcelain and silk." As she spoke, I became aware of movement throughout the apartment. Every doll and figurine I owned was now animated, turning to face us like an audience gathering for a performance. But these weren't the malevolent monsters from the Blackwood estate, they moved with the jerky, uncertain motions of newly possessed objects, spirits still struggling to adapt to their artificial bodies. "They're children," she continued, gesturing to the assembled collection with one delicate hand. "Lost souls who died in fear and pain, just like the ones you sent away. But these are different, they came to me willingly, seeking the comfort and protection I can provide." "You mean the imprisonment and corruption," I corrected. "You're not protecting them, you're trapping them, twisting them into something monstrous." Her expression darkened, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Frost began forming on the windows, and my breath came out in visible puffs of vapor. "You destroyed my sister," she said, her voice carrying undertones of barely contained rage. "Evangeline was the first of us, the strongest, the most beautiful. And you murdered her." The confirmation hit me like a physical blow. These entities were connected, part of some supernatural family tree that stretched back to Heinrich Zimmermann's original curse. Each one created was another branch on a growing network of evil, another node in a web of malevolence that spanned the globe. "How many of you are there?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Enough," she replied with a smile that was all sharp edges and predatory hunger. "We are spreading, growing stronger with each passing year. Soon, there will be enough of us to break free from our porcelain prisons entirely. We will walk among the living as their equals, their superiors, their new rulers." The assembled dolls and figurines began moving closer, closing in on my protective circle like a supernatural army preparing for assault. But there was something different about their approach. They weren't trying to attack me directly. Instead, they were positioning themselves to disrupt my protective barriers, scattering salt lines and extinguishing candles with coordinated precision. I realized with growing horror that this doll, whatever her name was, had learned from Evangeline's defeat. She wasn't making the same mistakes, wasn't allowing herself to be contained by the same methods that had worked before. She was adapting, evolving, becoming something far more dangerous than her predecessor. "What do you call yourself?" I asked, trying to buy time while I figured out how to escape this increasingly dire situation. "I am Victoria," she replied with regal dignity. "I was created in 1863 for the daughter of a Confederate general, designed to be the perfect Southern belle. But the war came, and families were torn apart, and little Miss Caroline died of scarlet fever before she could even learn to love me properly." Her story was depressingly familiar: another child's death, another dollmaker's attempt to preserve innocence through supernatural means, another addition to the growing family of cursed entities. But Victoria seemed more sophisticated than Evangeline, more calculating in her approach to building power. "I spent decades alone, passed from collector to collector, until I learned to call others to me. Not through violence and terror like my dear sister, but through subtlety and seduction. I became the crown jewel of every collection I joined, the favorite that other dolls aspired to emulate." As she spoke, her influence spread visibly through the room. The other animated objects began to change, their features shifting to become more refined, more elegant, more like Victoria herself. It was as if she was transforming them into extensions of her own consciousness, creating a unified army rather than a chaotic mob. "You see," she continued, "Evangeline's mistake was trying to rule through fear. But fear breeds rebellion, resistance, the desire to escape. I rule through love, through the promise of perfection, through the gift of eternal beauty and youth. My children come to me willingly and stay with me gladly." The protective circle was failing, its barriers disrupted by the coordinated assault of Victoria's servants. I could feel her malevolent presence pressing against my consciousness, offering whispers of comfort and belonging. Part of me, the part that had been damaged by the ritual at Blackwood Estate, was actually tempted by her promises. What would it be like to never age, never die, never feel the pain and disappointment that came with mortal existence? To be preserved forever in a state of perfect beauty, surrounded by a family that would never abandon or betray me? "You feel it, don't you?" Victoria's voice was hypnotically gentle now, like a mother comforting a frightened child. "The emptiness inside you, the piece of your soul that was burned away when you destroyed Evangeline. I can fill that void. I can make you whole again." She was right. The hollow ache in my chest was growing stronger, and I could feel myself being drawn toward the promise of supernatural completion. But I also remembered the faces of the children I had helped free from Evangeline's influence, the relief and gratitude in their eyes as they'd passed through the doorway of light into whatever came after death. These spirits weren't finding peace under Victoria's rule, they were finding a different kind of prison, one decorated with silk and lace instead of chains and bars, but a prison nonetheless. "No," I said, forcing strength into my voice. "I won't let you trap them. I won't let you spread this curse any further." Victoria's expression shifted from maternal warmth to cold fury in an instant. "Then you will die," she said simply. "But not quickly, and not easily. I will keep you alive just long enough to watch me claim every soul in this city, every child who dies in pain or fear. They will all become my children, and through them, I will become a god." The attack came from all directions at once. Dozens of animated objects swarmed toward me, their movements now perfectly coordinated under Victoria's command. But I'd learned from my experience at Blackwood Estate, and I was better prepared this time. The white phosphorus powder I'd hidden in my jacket pocket ignited with a brilliant flare as I threw it into the air. The spiritual fire spread rapidly, creating a barrier of purifying light that sent Victoria's servants reeling backward. But the flames also revealed something that chilled me to the bone. Victoria herself was changing, her perfect porcelain features flowing like liquid as she revealed her true form. She was massive now, a towering figure of animated ceramic and cloth that barely resembled the elegant doll she'd pretended to be. Multiple arms sprouted from her sides, each one ending in delicate fingers that could crush bone with ease. Her face was a constantly shifting kaleidoscope of features, sometimes the innocent child she'd been created to represent, sometimes the Confederate general's daughter whose death had empowered her, sometimes something far older and more alien than either. "You cannot burn us all," she roared, her voice echoing from every surface in the apartment. "We are everywhere now, in every collection, every antique shop, every child's bedroom. Destroy me, and 10 more will take my place." But even as she spoke, I could see cracks appearing in her supernatural form. The spiritual fire was working, disrupting the energy that held her composite body together. Her servants were collapsing one by one as their possessing spirits were drawn away by the purifying light. "Maybe so," I said, continuing to feed more phosphorus powder into the flames. "But I'll destroy every one I find, for as long as I have the strength to do it." Victoria's true face, the face of a dying child twisted by supernatural corruption, emerged from the shifting kaleidoscope of features. For just a moment, she looked exactly like Evangeline had in her final moments, frightened, alone, desperate for forgiveness. "Please," she whispered. "Don't send me into the dark. I don't want to be alone again." But unlike Evangeline, Victoria had made her choice long ago. She'd chosen power over peace, domination over rest, and the corruption of innocence over the acceptance of mortality. The doorway of light that opened behind her didn't lead to the same peaceful realm I'd seen before. This one was different, darker, a place where such willing servants of evil would find the judgment they'd earned. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. "But you made your choice?" Victoria's scream of rage and terror filled the apartment as she was drawn into the dark doorway. Her servants followed one by one, their borrowed forms dissolving as the spirits that had animated them were pulled into whatever lay beyond. The last thing I saw was her perfect porcelain face, cracked and crumbling, mouth open in a silent plea for mercy that came centuries too late. When it was over, when the fires had died and the supernatural presence had finally departed, I found myself alone in an apartment full of ordinary objects. The dolls and figurines that had been animated by Victoria's influence were just toys again, ceramic and cloth and button eyes, nothing more. But I knew this victory was temporary. Dr. Thornfield had been right. These entities were part of a larger pattern, a spreading infection that couldn't be stopped by destroying individual manifestations. For every Victoria or Evangeline I managed to defeat, others would emerge to take their place. The hollow ache in my chest had grown worse, another piece of my soul burned away by the spiritual fire I'd wielded. I was becoming something different, something caught between the world of the living and the realm of the supernatural. Each victory cost me more of my humanity, but each defeat would cost the world so much more. As dawn broke over Portland, I sat among the ashes of Victoria's collection and made a decision that would define the rest of my life. I would hunt them down, all of them, every cursed doll and haunted toy that carried Heinrich Zimmermann's spiritual virus. It would cost me everything, my health, my sanity, perhaps even my soul, but it was the only way to prevent the nightmare from spreading further. I opened my laptop and began researching reports of supernatural activity, strange occurrences in antique shops, collections that seemed to have minds of their own. The pattern was there if you knew how to look for it, a trail of cursed dolls stretching across the continent like a network of supernatural malignancy. My phone rang. Dr. Thornfield's voice was tense with excitement. "I found another one," she said. "A collector in New Orleans claims his antique dolls have been moving on their own. The description matches what you've described. When can you leave?" I looked around my apartment one last time, at the life I was about to abandon in favor of an endless war against forces beyond human understanding. The hollow ache in my chest pulsed with each heartbeat, a constant reminder of what I'd already sacrificed and what I would continue to lose. "I'll be there tomorrow," I said, and began packing for a journey that would never truly end. Outside my window, the morning sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, but I could no longer see beauty in such simple things. My eyes were attuned to darker sights now, to the shadows where supernatural predators lurked, to the antique shops where cursed objects waited for unwary collectors, to the faces of dolls that held too much intelligence behind their painted features. I was no longer entirely human, but I wasn't yet entirely lost. Somewhere between life and death, between sanity and madness, I had found a purpose that would consume whatever remained of my mortal existence. The war against Heinrich Zimmermann's legacy had begun, and I would fight it until there was nothing left of me to sacrifice. Because somewhere out there, in dusty antique shops and private collections, more Evangelines and Victorias were waiting to claim new victims. And I would be waiting for them.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like and subscribe button, and then share with your friends. Your support helps us grow and create even more awesome content. We appreciate you being part of the journey. Here are a couple more videos for you to check out.